Alright, my name is Dr. Thomas Webb. I'm a doctor working across longevity, sports medicine and human performance. Over the last few years, I've worked with doctors as well as executives, entrepreneurs, high-performing professionals, and I've learned a lot of things in terms of improving their health, longevity, energy, recovery, helping them become high performers at work and not actually feel like they're constantly burning out, stressing out. So if you clicked on this video, I want you to pat yourself on the back first of all, because actually just do it right now. I say that because in the 6 years I've spent working with doctors, founders, these high performers, one of the hardest things for people to admit is that they don't feel as sharp as they used to. They actually recognize this, and it's one of the hardest things to admit, especially as a doctor. You're constantly putting patients first, you're not putting yourself first. And we live in a culture that almost celebrates this sacrifice, and it's just part of the job. You know, you almost feel guilty for not being at your best, for feeling the best, for not being stressed. But the moment you start recognizing that your focus isn't what it used to be and you're no longer performing at the standard you expect from yourself, that's the moment when onwards you can actually start your recovery process. And when I say recovery process, I mean the journey to performing at your best self. I want you to listen to my words carefully. Close your tabs. Mute your notification. What I'm about to say in this video saved me personally from losing my own sanity from the career of being a doctor, and it might just save yours as well. After working with a lot of doctors, knowing colleagues, and being a doctor myself, I've realized something that I think medicine does a terrible job at preparing people for. Most doctors know how to recognize when a patient is becoming unwell, giving that a lot of attention. We've trained to spot patterns, we're trained to identify problems before they become catastrophes. We're trained to notice small changes that might indicate something bigger is going on underneath the surface. But for some reason, when it comes to ourselves, we completely lose that ability. And I've lost count of how many conversations I've had with doctors who can tell me exactly what's happening with their patients and yet can't seem to make sense of what's happening in their own lives or give it the same attention, importance, or significance. And what makes it even harder is that the symptoms don't actually always look particularly dramatic. Nobody comes into my world saying, "Thomas, I think I'm losing my edge." Or the founders, the entrepreneurs even that I've worked with, they don't say, "I'm here because I've noticed these things." They're a bit vague, and they describe this identity they've lost. They describe they want to just have that peace of mind. They want to look after themselves a bit better. So sometimes they'll tell me they've become increasingly irritable at home. Other times they'll tell me they've stopped exercising consistently, stopped reading, stopped doing the things they used to enjoy. And I completely understand this. In a doctor's life, you are very much stretched with time. You don't have time outside of work. Maybe you've got kids, a family. So oftentimes you're just reacting to things around you. You don't have those same time or energy for the things that used to preserve that identity you once had. So the common theme is that they don't feel like themselves anymore. And I remember reaching a point in my own life where I felt exactly the same. There wasn't some dramatic breakdown. There wasn't a moment where everything suddenly collapsed. Although I did move into a van and live there, but we'll talk about that another time. If anything, that would have been easier, because at least then I would have known something was wrong. What actually happened was much more insidious or confusing. I kept trying to solve the problem by becoming better, more disciplined, more productive, pushing harder, being almost harder on myself. But this would often make the problems worse and lead to these work hard, maximum discipline, and then kind of crash cycles. So I remember I'd sort my sleep out, or I'd get into training again, or I'd be really disciplined. But then as soon as I felt like I was on top of everything, I realized this wasn't sustainable, and often maybe I'd manage it for a week or two, but then I'd find myself right back where I started. And what frustrated me was that none of this made sense. I understood health, I understood the theory of it, I understood performance, I understood behavior change, yet I couldn't seem to consistently apply these things to my own life. Looking back now, I think the biggest mistake I made personally was assuming that because I knew what to do, I should automatically be able to do it. I held myself to these really high standards. I wasn't kind to myself. I saw things in black and white. I was a perfectionist. And, this is a very common pattern in doctors. We tend to be perfectionists. We tend to have high standards. And this can be a problem. It can get us really far in our career, but it can be a problem if we are trying to look after ourselves in a non-black and white scenario. So I just kept blaming myself every time this happened, and maybe that's what you're doing as well, because with doctors it's surprisingly normal. They're incredibly hard on themselves, much harder than they would ever be on a patient. For example, a patient comes in struggling and they'll immediately look for contributing factors, stress, sleep, environment, workload, recovery, support systems. But when it comes to yourself, often you will maybe skip all of that and go straight to self-criticism. You might assume you're the problem, and this is one of the biggest reasons so many doctors may feel stuck for so long, because if you believe you're the problem, that every solution starts looking like more effort, more discipline, more willpower, more pushing. But let me ask you something. If you've spent the last several years pushing harder and you still feel like you're losing your edge, why would the solution suddenly be to push even harder? And at some point we have to become curious. At some point we have to stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what's happening to me, because those are two very different questions. One leads to shame, guilt, but the other leads to understanding, and understanding is where things started changing for me. One of the things I realized was that I had spent years accumulating stress without really acknowledging it. Not dramatic stress, not that sort of stress that makes headlines, just the constant low-level pressure that comes from carrying responsibility for long periods of time. And medicine has a way of making that pressure feel normal. You finish one challenge and move straight on to the next. You adapt to one level of responsibility and then take on more. Maybe you step up to a registrar, and then the next thing is you're looking ahead to that consultant level of responsibility. It just starts feeling like life, but your nervous system doesn't work that way. Your nervous system keeps score. And when I talk about the nervous system, I'm simply talking about the systems in your brain and body that determine whether you're operating in a state of alertness, stress, or a state of recovery, calmness, and restoration. The problem is that many doctors spend years becoming exceptionally good at the first state and almost completely neglecting the second state. So we're very good at being amped up, very good at feeling that sense of cortisol in our body, adrenaline, and making those big decisions in those stressful, chaotic environments. But we're pretty bad at the opposite, going into a room, down-regulating after a shift, sitting in calmness, and letting go of those worries, those open loops. So recovery isn't just about taking time off. It is one of the biggest misconceptions I see. I've worked with a lot of founders running even multi-million-dollar businesses who have taken holidays and come back feeling exactly the same. So it's not necessarily about just taking time off. I've worked with doctors who've taken annual leave and spent the entire time feeling exhausted, dreading going back to work. So what actually is recovery? Because recovery isn't just the absence of work. Recovery is the presence of things that actually allow your mind and body to restore themselves. Recovery is the presence of things that actually allow your mind and body to restore themselves. It is the ability to switch off. Those are very different things. Now, obviously, this is something I go into much deeper and can pinpoint exactly in a personalized approach. If you do want to get into that, feel free to jump into a call and we can work with you. But for some, it might just be poor sleep. That might be your bottleneck. For some, it is years of overstimulation and constant mental input. The important thing is identifying the root causes properly, so we're actually targeting the specific bottleneck that you have, solving your actual problem rather than just fighting the symptoms for another 6 months or trying to improve 6 or 7 things all at once. That might not actually be moving the needle forward. So we want to identify your biggest return of investment, your bottleneck. In my own experience, I would finish work and consume content, listen to podcasts, watch YouTube, even scroll on my phone. And this wasn't a proper way to wind down. This was just distracting myself from how I was feeling. always taking in information and always consuming. And if you're doing this, you're always stimulating your brain. You're remaining in this high alert state. I was simply replacing one form of mental activity while I was on work on my shift with another. And eventually I realized that my brain hadn't experienced genuine quiet, genuine stillness for years. And I don't think I'm alone in that. A lot of doctors spend their entire day processing information, high cognitive load, high cognitive demand, and then spend their evenings processing different information. So your brain never really gets a chance to slow down. You never really get to practice that ability of relaxing. It never gets a chance to settle. It never gets a chance to process your thoughts. And over time, that catches up with you. Another thing that caught up with me was the gradual erosion of physical habits. Nothing dramatic. I didn't suddenly stop caring about my health. I just became slightly less consistent, slightly neglecting these things that gave me energy, that gave me health, that gave me longevity outside of medicine. So looking back, I realized that many of these things that used to keep me grounded had quietly disappeared from my life. Whether, for you that might be meditation, that might be going for a walk, that might be exercise. It could be sleep, it could be nutrition, it could be recovery. It could be all of these things. So these are the foundations that support everything else. These support your enthusiasm, your energy, your health. And if you neglect these, eventually it's going to catch up to you. It's going to affect your ability to make decisions. And when these foundations start weakening, every area of your life becomes harder, even if you can't immediately see the connection. So the good news is that getting your edge back is usually much less complicated than people think. It is not about following a generic program to get back to your level. It's about really listening to yourself and identifying those one or two bottlenecks that simply, if you put more attention and focus into, you could really get your sense of identity back, your sense of energy back. And when you do this, you rebuild trust in yourself. You rebuild that sense of self-importance, looking after yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are not a machine. You are not just a cog in the wheel, whether it's the NHS system, the Australian system, the American system. You are not just a robot. So the key is to listen to yourself and work with your biology, not against it. What I've seen happen when high performers do this, doctors, founders, once they really get to know their root cause, what they've been neglecting, and they focus on this, they really start to see these results. So if you've been feeling like you're losing your edge lately, I want you to stop assuming that you've become lazy, weak, or incapable, or that you just need to push harder. Get curious instead. Start paying attention. Start asking better questions, because in my experience, the doctors who recover fastest aren't necessarily the smartest or the most disciplined. They're the ones who are willing to stop fighting themselves long enough to understand what's actually going on. So if you'd like help identifying your personal bottleneck, what's actually driving your loss of performance and energy, and rebuilding a system to fix it properly, there's also information about working with me one-on-one in the description. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you on the next one.